The first sign was silence. Not the reverent kind that fills a chapel before dawn, but a silence so absolute that even the candles seemed afraid to crackle. Fulda Abbey had stood for centuries as a fortress of devotion stone, scripture, and unbroken prayer. But on that winter night in 782, the air changed. It thickened, it darkened, it tasted wrong. When Brother Massacre lifted the chalice during the midnight meal, he noticed the wine shimmer strangely in the torchlight and oily ripple that did not belong. He hesitated, but hunger and obedience outweighed instinct. Across the refectory, dozens of monks bowed their heads, hands folded, unaware that every breath they drew carried the scent of treachery. Minutes later, the first body fell. A wooden spoon clattered against stone, then another, and another. The sound echoed with sickening clarity, like hail striking the roof of a crypt. One chronicler later wrote that the monks collapsed as wheat beneath an unseen scythe. Another claimed the candles dimmed, as if the poison itself swallowed the light. There were no screams, only choking gasps, desperate fingers clawing at robes, and prayers half-spoken before dissolving into blood. Fulda Abbey, heart of learning and sanctuary of Charlemagne's empire, became a tomb in the span of a single hour. The very place that had preserved knowledge, healed the sick, and taught kings how to kneel had been murdered from within, and no one outside its walls heard a thing. Not the nearby villages, not the guards at the gate, not even the brothers still alive long enough to crawl toward the chapel door. By dawn, every monk who had tasted the wine lay stiff on the refectory floor, their faces frozen in a mixture of shock and devotion, martyrs of a massacre erased before it was ever recorded. For centuries, the truth of what happened that night slept beneath layers of soot, ritual, and silence. Some blamed pagan raiders, others whispered of political rivals. But recently, a rediscovered manuscript hidden in Fulda's archives under Wormington parchment trivial details too precise to ignore. A name, a motive, a method. The monks were not victims of random cruelty. They were targets, and their killer walked freely into the abbey that night, welcomed as a brother. If you listen closely, the stones of Fulda still seem to hold their breath, as though remembering the moment their walls swallowed the largest mass poisoning of the medieval age. The morning after the poisoning, Fulda Abbey looked untouched, quiet, orderly, devout. Frost clung to the cloister arches, like pale lace. The bells still hung in their towers. The candles in the chapel had burned down to soft amber stubs. From a distance, nothing seemed amiss, but inside, the air had soured. Fulda had been built to withstand siege, betrayal, and the slow grind of centuries. What it could not withstand was the treachery of a single hand. Its walls, once symbols of faith, had become accomplices. Every corridor, every stone ledge, every sealed door tightened the trap around the men who trusted them. The abbey's layout was meant to guide monks toward discipline, the refectory for meals, the scriptorium for learning, the chapel for devotion, the dormitory for rest. A perfect rhythm forged through prayer and silence. But that rhythm also made the poisoning inevitable. The monks drank together, they ate together, they prayed together. One tainted chalice became a shared death sentence. When Brother Godfred, one of the few who had not attended the midnight meal, pushed open the refectory door, he froze. The long wooden tables were overturned, benches splintered, bowls scattered across the stones like abandoned offerings. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some slumped against pillars. Others curled as though in prayer. Many collapsed mid-step, reaching for a salvation that came too late. The smell was unmistakable. Not decayed, had not yet ripened, but bitterness. A sharp, metallic temps that clung to the tongue. Godfred stumbled back, crossing himself again and again. He opened windows, though he knew fresh air could not undo what had been done. In the cold morning light, the truth was icy clear. The refectory was no longer a place of communion. It was a crime scene. As he searched for survivors, his footsteps echoed through the halls. Nobody answered. The scriptorium was silent, inkpots uncapped, quills fallen from numb hands. The dormitory beds remained neatly made. The brothers had never returned to them. Even the chapel sanctuary of all sanctuaries felt wrong. The incense hanging in the air could not mask the lingering scent of poisoned wine. Fulda Abbey was no longer a house of God. It had become the perfect container for murder, and outside its heavy oak doors. The world kept moving, unaware that one of the most devastating massacres in medieval monastic history had unfolded in the dark. No alarms, no torches, no guards. Just silence. But silence in Fulda was never empty. It was holding something back. A truth, a name, a betrayal powerful enough to shake the foundations of an empire. Fulda Abbey had seen enemies before Saxon raiders, pagan warlords, even jealous nobles who envied its influence. But none of them ever breached its walls the way this assassin did. Quietly, patiently, dressed not in armor, but in humility. On the night of the poisoning, the brothers believed they were welcoming a fellow servant of God, a traveler, a pilgrim, a man whose robes were dusted with frost, whose voice carried the softness of prayer. But beneath his courteous bows and trembling piety lay something colder than winter purpose. The abbey gatekeeper later recalled how the stranger avoided the light, choosing instead to linger in the shadows of the cloister. He asked for shelter, warmth, and food, nothing suspicious. Fulda had sheltered thousands of wanderers. Hospitality was a virtue carved into its foundation. Yet one monk noticed something strange. The traveler never removed his gloves, not to pray, not to eat, not even when he offered to help pour the refectory wine. Brother Massacre, the first to fall, remembered a faint scent when the chalice was lifted, something like crushed almond and bitter herbs, but he was tired, hungry, and unaware that death sometimes hides behind sweetness. The poisoner moved through the abbey as if guided by familiarity. He knew which doors were left unlocked at night, which hallways remained empty, which monks were assigned to kitchen duty. He slipped between cloisters with unnerving certainty, leaving no footprints on the frost. Some later swore he must have once lived among them, perhaps even worn the same robes he now used as disguise. But his greatest advantage was the monks' trust. They believed danger lived outside the walls, not within them. They had no tools to detect treachery, no imagination for murder. Their innocence became the poisoner's camouflage. Historians long debated his motive. Was he sent by the Saxons, whose rebellion simmered under Charlemagne's rule? Was he an agent of a rival monastery seeking Fulda's lands and influence? Or was he a lone zealot, convinced the abbey had strayed from the purity of early monastic life? The newly uncovered manuscript suggests something more personal. One line, written in trembling Latin, reads, "He spoke our prayers better than we did," a chilling hint that the poisoner was not merely an intruder, he was an imitator. A reflection of the abbey's own discipline twisted into a weapon. After the poisoning, he vanished. No footprints on the snow, no record of departure, no witness who survived long enough to describe his face. All that remained was his shadow etched across the refectory, lingering in the overturned chalices, lingering in the stunned stillness of an abbey that never imagined its death would come from inside. And yet the story was far from over. Because when the monastery fell silent, the empire began to ask questions, and Fulda's secrets grew louder than its prayers. The massacre at Fulda Abbey did not remain hidden for long. Monasteries could suffer famine, raids, or fire without attracting imperial attention, but a mass death inside one of Charlemagne's most prized religious institutions was something different. Fulda was no ordinary abbey. It was a pillar of imperial faith, a guardian of learning, and a political anchor in a region where loyalty shifted like snow across the Rhine. When word reached Charlemagne's court in Aachen, the emperor reportedly stood in stunned silence. Fulda was home to scholars he trusted, advisors who had shaped his laws, monks who had copied the very manuscripts that defined his kingdom. To lose them all in one night was not merely tragedy, it was insult. It meant someone had dared to strike at the empire through the cloth of devotion. Messengers were dispatched at once. Riders galloped through sleet and mud, arriving at Fulda with torches that cast long, trembling shadows across the abbey walls. What they found chilled even hardened soldiers. The refectory looked untouched by violence, no arrows, no broken doors, no signs of forced entry. Yet the monks lay sprawled in frozen prayer, lips stained dark, fingers curled like roots reaching for salvation. The investigators noted something else. The wine barrels had been tampered with, but skillfully. No splinters, no scratches, only a thin residue clinging inside the stavesa, substance bitter enough to sting the tongue, even after days exposed to the cold. Rumors multiplied faster than answers. Some whispered that the Saxons had done it, seeking revenge for forced baptisms. Others blamed rival abbeys, jealous of Fulda's influence. A few more fearful than logical believed the monks had been punished by God for secret sin. Charlemagne rejected all of these. He ordered an inquiry, unprecedented in scope, led by imperial envoys and church authorities. Their arrival turned Fulda into a fortress of suspicion. Every surviving brother was interrogated. Even the gatekeeper was questioned until his voice gave out. The abbey's archives were combed, manuscripts sifted for hidden hostility, letters examined for treason. Then came the discovery that changed everything. In the scriptorium, beneath a stack of half-finished manuscripts, investigators found a scrap of parchment bearing a single sentence. "He prayed with us, but his voice was not his own." The handwriting matched that of Brother Godfrey, the only monk who survived the initial night but died shortly after. His final words, a desperate warning. The Empire now knew two things with certainty. The massacre was deliberate, and the killer had been among them long enough to learn their prayers. This realization sent tremors through the imperial court. If Fulda could be infiltrated, so could Aachen. So could any monastery or stronghold. The abbey was no longer just a religious site, it was a symbol of vulnerability, and its silence accused the empire itself. And beneath that silence, something darker lurked, a motive powerful enough to justify the annihilation of an entire brotherhood. For months, the imperial inquiry circled Fulda, like a wolf unable to find the throat. There were clues, footprints in snow, a faint trail of bitterness on the lip of a chalice, but nothing that answered the question the empire feared most. Why? The abbey's archives, once a sanctuary of learning, became a labyrinth of suspicion. Scholars poured through illuminated manuscripts, searching for coded messages, hidden grievances, anything that might explain the massacre. Most pages were scripture or annals devout, orderly, unblemished by malice. Then, one winter afternoon, an imperial scribe named Eginard made a discovery so small it was almost overlooked. At the back of a prayer codex wedged between two stiffened parchment leaves lay a loose sheet. Worm-eaten at the edges, its ink faded to the color of dried blood. On it was a single paragraph. No title, no date, no name. Just a confession written in trembling Latin. He enters our halls with the shape of piety, but his heart is a tomb. He carries no weapon but patience. Brothers trust him. I hear him pray, yet the prayer is hollow, like a well with no water. If I die, let this be found. The handwriting belonged to Brother Ansagurtha, first monk to lift the poisoned chalice. His final warning had been hidden in the book he was copying the night before he died. Eginard felt the hairs on his neck rise. This was no vague suspicion. This was witness testimony carved into fear. In the margins of the sheet were 4 more words, written hastily, almost violently. Nen frater, imitator, not a brother, an imitator. The investigators gathered around the parchment as if it were a holy relic. If the poisoner was an imitator, then he had studied the brothers. He knew their rituals, their schedules, their voices. Someone who had lived among monks or wished desperately to become one. Further examination revealed faint fingerprints on the parchment, preserved in soot. They did not match any surviving brother. But the pattern long hands, narrow fingers matched a man once exiled from another abbey for doctrinal agitation. His name appeared only once in imperial records. Duderic of Hersfeld, a monk turned heretic who preached that church wealth corrupted the soul and that monastic life should be reduced to poverty, silence, and suffering. Fulda Abbey, wealthy and influential, would have been an affront to his ideals, a ripe target, a symbol to be cleansed. Duderic vanished years earlier, believed to have died in the forests, but the manuscript suggested otherwise. It implied he had returned not to rejoin the monastic life he had abandoned, but to purge it. The inquiry's scope widened overnight. Envoys followed trails of rumor across villages and monasteries. Everywhere they asked, "Have you seen a monk who prays too perfectly?" Some said yes, some said no. All lowered their voices, because if Duderic truly walked again, then Fulda's massacre was not a single act of revenge. It was the opening chapter of something far more dangerous. In the years before the massacre, Duderic of Hersfeld had been little more than a murmured warning among abbots, a man whose brilliance rivaled his bitterness. He had once been celebrated for his ascetic discipline, his mastery of scripture, his near-angelic devotion. But something in him had cracked under the weight of expectation. He began preaching a doctrine so severe that even the strictest monks recoiled. "Strip the abbeys of wealth," he wrote. "Strip the monks of comfort. Strip the church of its pride. When he declared that monasteries had grown fat on the sins they claimed to cure, the council cast him out. Hirschfeld expelled him, neighboring abbeys denied him shelter, and imperial authorities marked him as disturbing of ecclesiastical peace. Then he vanished, swallowed by forests, famine, or the silence of the unrecorded dead. Until Fulda. After the manuscript's discovery, imperial envoys scoured the countryside. They questioned shepherds, travelers, hermits. They found whispers, a stranger sleeping in abandoned chapels, a man chanting psalms with perfect cadence but empty eyes, a hooded figure leaving offerings on grave mounds long after midnight. The descriptions converged into a single haunting image: Duderic, thinner than memory, his robes patched with wool and leather, his hair shorn in a monk's tonsure, though no monastery claimed him. But the most chilling report came from a charcoal burner living in the woods east of Fulda. He described meeting a monk who asked for water and spoke with unsettling gentleness. As they talked, the burner noticed the man never blinked when the smoke blew into his face. He stood too still. He breathed too quietly. Before leaving, the monk said something the burner never forgot. "They will wake when the church sleeps." Duderic's doctrine had evolved into something darker, an obsession with purification through suffering. Wealthy houses like Fulda were to him tumors on the faith, and tumors, he believed, must be cut out. Investigators tracked the burner's account to a makeshift shelter in the woods. Inside, they found scraps of parchment pinned to the walls, lines of scripture rewritten, until the words fractured under their own fervor. At the center hung a map of Thuringia, marked with tiny charcoal crosses. Fulda's cross was the largest. But what terrified the envoys was not the map. It was the bowl left beside it, stained with residue identical to the poison found at Fulda. Duderic had lived there recently. He might still be near. The crosses on the map suggested one horrifying truth: Fulda was not his final destination. As winter deepened, sightings grew more frequent. Villagers spoke of a monk walking alone through snowfall, his steps soundless, his presence heavy as confession. Some thought he was a ghost, others believed he was a prophet. But those who knew Fulda's fate understood the truth. Duderic had returned to finish what he started, and he would not stop until his vision of a purified church was carved into the bones of every abbey he touched. Fulda Abbey never truly recovered from that winter. The walls were scrubbed, the refectory rebuilt, the chapel reconsecrated, but the silence that followed the massacre settled into the stone like frost that refused to thaw. New brothers joined, new prayers rose, new manuscripts were copied, yet something in the abbey remained hollow, as though each echo carried the memory of 100 dying breaths. Charlemagne's investigators eventually closed their inquiry without resolution. They named no culprit, issued no decree, recorded no verdict. The empire could not admit that one man, one former monk, had outwitted both church and crown. Fulda survived, but the truth did not. Duderic's name vanished from official chronicles. His crimes were buried beneath layers of clerical caution. But history rarely forgets what stone remembers. In 1721, masons repairing a wall in the north cloister found a crack wide enough to slip a hand through. Behind it lay a cavity filled with broken pottery, scraps of parchment, and a single wooden bowl lined with blackened residue. Alongside it rested a note written in old Carolingian script: "Let God judge him who wore our robes, yet carried no soul." The handwriting matched Brother Godfred the survivor, whose warning parchment had been found in the scriptorium centuries earlier. Even as he lay dying, he had hidden these fragments away, hoping someone in the future might understand what the empire chose to forget. And perhaps someone did. For later records mention an unnamed hermit captured outside Hirschfeld the following spring, a man with a tonsure, eyes unnervingly calm and hands stained dark as if from herbs. He died before questioning, refusing food and water, praying in a whisper until his final breath. His identity was never confirmed. His grave was unmarked, but in the margins of an abbey chronicle dated that same year, a scribe added for quiet words, "He prayed too well." Today, tourists wander Fulda's cloisters, unaware that beneath their feet lies a story sharper than any sword, a tragedy wrapped not in battle, but in trust. The air feels normal, clean, peaceful. But if you stand alone long enough, especially at dusk, you might sense something watching from the old stones. Not a ghost, but a memory, a warning, because the massacre at Fulda Abbey was not a tale of death alone. It was a judgment one delivered not by God or emperor, but by a man so convinced of righteousness that he poisoned the innocent to restore what he believed the church had forgotten. And in that judgment lies the truth the empire sought to bury, that faith, in the wrong hands, can become deadlier than any blade. If this story followed you into the dark tonight, let it stay. Leave a thought for those who died, believing the world outside their abbey walls was still merciful. And if you choose to walk further into these shadows, subscribe and step deeper into the labyrinth of forgotten truths, because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how much they hurt.